Hello, everyone. This is Jim Nasr. I hope you guys are doing well. Good morning to my compatriots here in the North America region, and then good afternoon to folks over in Dubai and everywhere else. Glad to connect with you all. I'm going to be really continuing conversation around consent. I think it's come up in at least the last three conversations that we've heard, the panel that Alex ran and the BlockQ presentation and before that. So it's a very important concept. And I think the thing that all of us are recognizing is this idea of an individual's role in consent and how does it manifest itself? And then also really how can we use blockchain to help? So really quick, just what is it and how big of a deal is it? It's a big deal. It's difficult. It's critical to manage. And if you look at those industries, that's just a sampling. That's what we're focused on. There's big opportunities for consent. And the data that really you're consenting to, you're agreeing to for various usage and context, is any number of data types, health data, ID data, biometrics, fitness. Certainly fitness has really picked up. Clinical data, of course, biosamples, you name it. There's a lot of different kinds of data, and that kind of this idea of consenting and consenting discreetly, specifically, is really important. With the practice of just signing a piece of paper and hoping for the best, those days, I think, thankfully, are coming to an end. Not very quickly, but they are coming to an end just because the data is so much richer and there's so much more value in it. So, there's always a regulatory angle when it comes to privacy, data usage, healthcare in general. I think what's important to understand is really what's relevant right now in context of some of these things that you see on the screen. So GDPR, the General Data Protection Regulations, has been around for a few years now, 3 years. And the CCPA, which is the California Consumer Protection Act, has been around since last year. Unfortunately, with COVID and all of the impact and attention on that, the CCPA in the U.S., was somewhat maybe under spoken of and under understood. However, the net of it really is very similar regulations for protecting an individual's rights, the Bill of Rights, and really the basis for consent applies equally. And we see regulators and regulations as being critical in this idea of how do you deal with change in consent? How do you manage, for instance, dynamic consent and things like this? And it's great to see the regulators actually being forward-thinking, proactive in this area. So, it's not an optional thing. We've seen all kinds of fines. There's all kinds of news stories about this. It's a serious proposition from a large organization's perspective, but not just large organizations. So, as an example, in the U.S. with the CCPA, the California Consumer Protection Act, any company that's over $25 million could have individual fines of $4,000 or more. That very, very quickly adds up. And that's a serious thing, even for small and medium-sized companies, never mind much larger ones like Google and others, as you see here. And then also the impact really is a lot of things, not just fines, but also damaging reputation, bad data, clinical trials failing. There's a saying in clinical trials that there is no clinical trial without consent. And that's a very important concept. So moving on, the reality is the genie is out of the bottle. There is no going back. Gartner did a study last year, and they predict that in a couple of years, roughly 65% of the population of the world is going to be protected using some kind of data privacy regulation. That's a lot of people. That's a lot of consent to keep track of. There's a lot of agreements that individuals and organizations need to understand, but also really need to be able to enact upon. And I think a lot of this really goes to this idea that data is more and more valuable, and many of us have talked about this. So here's another little piece of data, that even in America, where I think we've been rather indifferent and lethargic about privacy, certainly compared to Europe. Here's a study from last year by Harris that 89% of Americans are more aware and they want to have more control over their data and how it's being used. I think the blogs with Google, with Facebook, with Cambridge Analytica, these things have been mainstream news, and I think this created awareness, a lot more awareness for the individuals, around this, and also understanding that, there are companies, again, Facebook is a good example, that are making an enormous amount of money by making us the product. Same thing with Google and YouTube and et cetera. So, however, the individuals really don't have a say in it or have not. And that's an opportunity, and this is something that Americans are becoming aware of. All right, so, there's another angle to this, other than regulations and the fact that there's a massive amount of data being created in all kinds of different formats, exotic formats. And really it's this idea that, do we want to be the product? Do we want to be Facebook and Google's product, Amazon's product? Yes, we get some free services through a high amount of advertisement, but what's happening also is that we're getting manipulated. There's a lot of studies on this, and very, very bright people have spoken about this. One of the luminaries in this area is a gentleman named Jaron Lanier. He's a very well-known computer scientist and really talks about this idea of the kind of the philosophical angles of you being used as a product. And this paper that he wrote for Harvard Business Review a couple of years ago kind of talks about this. But a net of it really is at least that I'm cherry picking these key ideas that data creators should really get value from their data. The individuals should have a say in how their data is marketed. And then also, it's not that straightforward to go from organizations owning and, quote, managing all their data and your consented data to you doing it individually. However, it's doable if you have these essentially mediators, but fiduciary mediators. So they're fiduciary, like a legal firm or legal organization that basically works with the organization on behalf of the individual. And this is a very critical idea that we think is at the heart of what we're thinking about and technology we're building. All right, so that was a little bit about kind of consent. Really, this is kind of what the landscape looks like right now. I think most of us have experienced this as individuals. We have really no idea what we've signed, what it, allows people to do or not to do, where it is, who's got it, how long it's for, none of those things. It's been largely on paper and highly kind of duplicative and ultimately out of control. And it turns out, and we've worked with a number of very big organizations and some startups in this area, that organizations actually kind of feel very similar, that they don't really know who signed what the data is covered, what the regulators are going to come and ask them to prove or not prove. And ultimately, they're throwing a lot of money and resources to doing this, and that's not efficient. They would like to have a better approach as well. Everybody kind of sees this future coming where the individual has much more say, if not control, over their data. All right, so Houston is out of control. I'm not going to go through all of these. I think we've talked about most of it, but there's a high amount of friction, and that leads to frustration, that leads to lack of trust, particularly from patients, particularly in healthcare. We talk about the regulators, but then there's also rapid innovation. All these devices that we wear, they're creating data. Where's the data going? Who's using it? Did I provide consent to this? Is it private? How long is it being retained? How am I getting communicated to, about what a company is doing or not doing, and whether or not, if they're selling their data, as example, through secondary data studies, for instance, from one clinical trial to feed into a different protocol. What do I know about that? There's all kinds of issues like this. This idea of a personal data harvesting is a very big thing because there's a lot of money in it. You can take data, you can aggregate it, you can anonymize it, you can use it in different forms. You can do federated learning on it. Heather talked about that in the prior conversation. But there's all kinds of ways in which data could be unethically used and without the consent or even any kind of acknowledgement or understanding of the actual owner of the data. So this applies to all kinds of people, all kinds of jobs. I think we're mainly focused on the healthcare space and life sciences. That's really what my company does. Acoer, we build products in this space, but it really goes across the gamut. Okay, so there's an opportunity, right? This is when you look at the landscape, if you look at the technology, all the things that we talked about, the regulatory attention, and also the societal kind of awareness. I think what we think here is, and we're working with with a company called Consent Custody as one of our first and premier customers in this whole area, is this idea that there is an inflection point coming for consent and managing consent, and not in the same old, paper PDF, fillable PDF, transcript of an audio, things like this. I think those are tools and mechanisms to get there. However, that's not mechanism for managing and going forward. And really the thing from a kind of a model perspective, we think that it comes down to these 3 C's. This idea of custody of consent, safekeeping it, the idea of continuity of consent, like what happens if the context changes, if we need to reconsent, if there is a next step, if you pass away, or if there is a mental capacity issue, how do you continue to your next of kin? All these things are not really very well thought through at this stage and are not really well implemented. And they get into the idea of a dynamic consent. And then also this idea of like a clearing, which is like notification and what happens, for instance, for death certifications. And we do a lot of work with mortality data as example. All these kind of questions come up. And I think the current mechanisms and tools, in many ways, if not, completely non-effective, they're certainly not efficient. And at the bottom, you see some approaches that we have considered. All right. So what is the solution, right? We think that basically as a business idea, that the solution is this concept of having a fiduciary that acts as a custodian. So fiduciary, basically their interest is your interest. In this case, to help an organization to manage an individual's interest, because the data belongs to the individual. We all can agree on that, at least in healthcare for sure. And then this idea that as a custodian, you are safekeeping the assets. It doesn't mean you own the assets. That's not the idea. But you are responsible for tracking, for making sure that it's auditable, that the history is accurate, that you report when it's reporting is required to regulators, to individuals, to third parties, etc. To in case of court cases, you name it. There's all kinds of use cases, and essentially provide trust services. And that's really, I think, a segue of like, well, where does blockchain fit in, right? I think all of us, are probably rather familiar with this idea that, if you think in blockchain, the very first question is, do you need trust? Do you need to provide or impute trust, to a group of organizations or individuals where it doesn't already exist or where people don't even know each other? So, okay, let's say it's trust, and blockchain is very much infrastructure. This is really a plumbing. You build things on it. It's kind of like the internet, like the HTTPS protocol is the secure kind of transport layer for building internet applications. However, it's not an application app itself. Blockchain is similar kind of idea. So, okay, you use blockchain for infrastructure because you want trust, but is that enough? In our opinion, and this is really kind of something I'm very I guess this drives all of my energy and the work we do is it practical? And if it's practical, then we think that these kind of ideas need to be present, if not in its entirety, then certainly to a large degree. We're big believers in transparency, that if you're going to be doing this, especially if you're talking about tracking consent, public consent that's tied to an individual, to different applications, that there needs to be some kind of public transparency and auditability. Transactions we're talking about, it could be thousands, tens of thousands per second. And certainly, as an example, we're working with a very big, organization, healthcare organization here in the US for consent. And we're talking about millions of transactions or consent transactions per month. So it needs to be scalable. It's not acceptable for it not to be scalable. But also, we're really big believers that it needs to be real time, which means that it takes just seconds to get the finality of transactions on a ledger. If it's taking minutes or hours or days or whatever, or if it's done in an unfair order, that's not going to meet our criteria. We're also big believers in this idea that, we are custodians to our environment. We cannot be burning up, an entire country's worth of energy to do this kind of work. It needs to be sustainable. It needs to be sustainable long term. It needs to use minimal amount of energy. It needs to be economically viable, which means that, if we're using as example non-fungible tokens and the price is anywhere from $800 as example, now using optimistic with the layer 2 and things like this, maybe it's $50. Is that economically viable if you're talking about millions of transactions? In our opinion, that's not really the case. So you have to choose a technology that makes sense. And then also this idea of, is the pricing stable or is the pricing variable that, based on transaction volume, it could be up and down. If it's up and down, it's very, very difficult to build reliable infrastructure and reliable technologies or business models really off of it. Privacy preserving is very, very important for obvious reasons. And then finally, last but not least, this idea of is it easy to adopt? In our language, can you abstract the blockchain infrastructure? So you build useful, usable applications on it without having to worry about all of the, quote, mumbo jumbo of blockchain, such as managing keys, the underlying cryptocurrency, shared secrets, all of these things to us make it more difficult to adopt. All right. So there's I'm sure you guys are probably familiar with the song, Somebody's Watching Me from in the early 80s. So I always feel like somebody's watching me. Well, it turns out there's actually a principle behind this idea of the Hawthorne effect. So the more, the more you realize you're being observed or monitored, the more likely that you're going to change your behavior and more likely change your behavior to be compliant, which means you're going to be a good actor. So we kind of see it, I kind of see it as blockchain being a mechanism to really kind of like overtly let you know that you're being audited, you're being tracked, it's immutable, it's reportable in real time, ideally. And then I think in many ways, what we have seen empirically is that actually changes the behavior to be a better actor and to be really compliant to what you're supposed to be. So in terms of a solution, we have built a technology that really at the heart of it is about this idea of using a public blockchain, we use Hedera, having transactions, this being consent, that are going through private databases, essentially being referenced using a non-fungible token that acts as a key. That's the basic idea, right? Now, again, we're not going to talk too much about non-fungible tokens, but the net of it is that this is global, it's unique, it's indivisible, and you can essentially create it as a reference, as an anchor, and then you can associate other kinds of interactions to it. And I'm going to hopefully demo that real quick. So as you can kind of see, this idea that we have different stakeholders in the mix, certainly individuals, but more so, sponsors in the case of clinical trials and various consortia and so on. But really at the heart of kind of interacting with them from a consent perspective, you can have this non-fungible token. That's the basic hypothesis that we have. Right? So this basically has led us over the last 9 months or so, and quite a bit of work with really, really bright people and quite a bit of investment to build this technology called Consent Hash. I'm going to hopefully do a quick demo for you guys, but it's the idea that is really based on open APIs. It's really back-end technology. It's very easy to consume because it's serverless. So kind of like you would use Google Maps as an example, you can use this essentially just by knowing what the API is and what to feed it. It's all encrypted. It's real time. It uses the Hedera blockchain, but then also, as I mentioned, it uses non-fungible tokens. All right. So some of the benefits, again, I think we've kind of talked about most of these, but this idea of having multiple sources, being able to track data from different sources, but also facilitate usage across different applications. So as an example, on your phone, maybe you could use it using the Apple Health Kit or your favorite, Fitbit or Peloton app and things like this. There's a lot of consent required for that, but also maybe even, in terms of communicating with your your GP or your physician in terms of passing on some of that information to them. So that's kind of it in terms of just a quick background. I'm going to be very brave and actually show this for you live. But what I'm showing you here is live, so hopefully my internet will not go down. So what I'm showing you here is, and I'm not going to go through the full thing, but we have this idea that, by the way, this is just a demo site. This is just to demonstrate back-end functionality, that the actual interface that manifests this could happen through an app, could happen through a portal. We're working with a client, consent custody, and that's through a nice, pretty portal. But this demonstrates functionality. But we have this idea that there's an organization involved, and there's a user involved, and then there's, where you store it. You'll notice though that in this case, the organization has this weird number, and the user has this weird number. And the reason is, and I'm going to show you just real quick, if I go and create, let's say, Blockchain Summit, as an example, you'll notice in real time, we're using a one-time, what was called saltification, basically one-time encryption, and we're creating an opaque ID. The reason is that this ID is actually going to go on a public blockchain, right? And it's really, really important that we don't inadvertently divulge private information that make it easier for someone to then reverse engineer what we did. That's really important. If I refresh this, you'll notice that was the file, that was the organization we just created, right? So I'm not gonna go through all the functionality here. That's gonna take a bit of time, and I don't have that much time. I'm just gonna show you what a consent kind of looks like. I'm gonna go back to this organization I've created before. Here's my user. You'll notice I have a couple of tokens here. There's one that says revoked, or rather there's a couple of consents. Again, everything is encrypted because this information is in a public blockchain. This one is in a draft mode, and with our design, we have a basic life cycle here that we've implemented for this demo, which is a consent is created. A consent is, let me actually kind of really quickly show you how the consent is created. Since we're here, so I'll just go back here. Here's my user. Here's my store. And basically we're going to pull up. Let's go and pull up a consent file. Like a typical consent file, informed consent. It's a PDF. You can see in real time being encrypted. I'm just going to submit this. And as I'm submitting this is going to go into our system, but also at the same time, we're creating a transaction that's going to go on the blockchain. And I can prove that to you. This is kind of what's happening behind the scenes. So you'll notice that was, what I did 2 minutes ago, just creating an organization, and this is literally what I just did right now. And I can prove to you in real time that this is actually what's happening. I'm going to Hedera blockchain, and we have built this technology that basically triangulates two different explorers. And then you'll notice kind of, what really was happening, that we kind of went in there and you can see this consent document was created. That was that's the encrypted hash for it. That's our signature, the cryptographic signature. Both of these explorers show the same thing. If I really wanted to be geeky and show you all of the underlying things, this is the actual fees that we incurred, and so on and so forth. I'm not going to go too much into that. But real quick, I want to kind of just show you one last thing before I run out of time. Going back to this organization. So we can see that that's the new consent that we created. I'm just going to enable this, which means it's live. It's going to be on the, if you like, on the live system. It's available. But the really, really important thing here is this. I'm going to refresh this real quick, and hopefully that's done in real time. Not yet. Let's try it again. Okay, look. So you see this token thing has appeared. So what we have done is that in real time, you guys saw this. We have created a non-fungible token using Hedera. Here's a token. But what's really, really important is that this non-fungible token is already showing the chain of custody. It's already showing the transactions that have happened for the specific consent. So, if I go back here and you can see this other one that's revoked, which I did before, you can see there's 3 transactions. So that's basically, the first one was to draft it. This is to enable it. That's to revoke it. And all of these are public transactions. So if I click on this, again, just like I showed you before, in real time, we're able to demonstrate that, look, here's exactly what happened. That was a revoked consent transaction. Here's what was revoked, so on and so forth. So this idea of high amount of accountability in real time, and to give you a sense of perspective, because cost is important, I mentioned that. This transaction that I ran, this creating a token, cost me 1 cent. That is a predictable cost. Using Hedera, 1 cent is the cost that I incurred. So if I'm doing millions of transactions, that's thousands of dollars a month. That's very, very reasonable. That's a predictable rather, and very, very reasonable, economically viable cost. One last thing I want to show you just before my time runs out here, let's go back to the Explorer, is that, again, we have all kinds of like real security built in, and like a rolling hash, which you can see is updating, which basically, in our system goes back and looks at the prior transactions, just like the proof of work does, and says, hey, has there been any kind of interruption? Has there been any kind of manipulation of data? Just to make sure that the data integrity is maintained. You can see the NFTs we issued. That was one we just issued 2 minutes ago. These are our nodes. So you can see right now we've deployed them around the world. We have 4 in the US. We have 1 in Sao Paulo, Brazil, and 1 in Japan, and 1 in Belgium, and then, or rather in Germany. And then, so that's our nodes. You can see the transactions that have run on this. This is the underlying network. This is the underlying Hedera network. So not only are we distributed, they are also distributed. And then one last thing, just, because I don't want you guys to think there's smoke and mirrors happening. This is the actual way we manage our infrastructure. So you can see this is the infrastructure for Acoer. We work with a company called Control Plane. So right now for Consent Hash, we have, we use 2 Amazon regions, 1 in Frankfurt, 1 in Oregon, 1 Azure, and 1 Google Cloud. So if any one of these goes down, or if for regulatory needs, if we're working, for instance, it's a real case, we're working with a company in Switzerland, and they want the data to remain in Switzerland, whatever form it is, we're able to instantiate the location or the storage as well as the processing if necessary in that location. So that's kind of a very, very quick. I didn't want to be too PowerPointy. I think it's very easy to be jaded about PowerPoint and not show real things. And I think we should be doing real things. We should not be just talking about hypothetics. I think we should be, at this stage of the game, we should be talking about what's real. This is us, Acoer. We're a product company, and happy to work with you guys. I know I've run out of time. I'll be available on the lobby if you have any questions. Thank you so much.